Early December 2024, Russian aircraft bombed Syrian cities of Aleppo and Idlib. Yes, the Kremlin occupiers have been helping the regime there for almost 10 years. However, this time there is one fundamental difference. In the first long time, Syrian rebels led by the opposition organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham went on the offensive and captured more than 30 settlements. They are advancing, so Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad has again asked for help from his friends from the cannibalistic regimes, Iran and the Russian Federation. Anything can happen in 24 hours. Insurgents can overthrow a decades-long oppressive, corrupt, and toxic government. Or maybe not. What will be the reaction of the Western world? Why is Syria a continuous battlefield that flares up every few years? How do Russia and Iran divide interests in this region? This is the 24 Hours to Peace program, and we are summing up mistakes, verbal declarations about failures and indifference of the democratic world in order to reflect. Every 24 hours we do get closer to peace in different regions of the world, but no one knows yet what its price will be. In order to understand what is happening in Syria now, we need to look into the distant past of this country. The end of World War II and the redistribution of the world order freed many countries from the control of other states. This is what happened to Syria. In 1946, the last French troops left the area. As a result, Syria declares its independence. In the Middle East, democracy is cautiously sprouting, but it is being drowned out by the interests of other countries and the constant squabbles with the imposed neighborhood. This time, they are not occupying, but imposing the regimes of their protégés. At the beginning of 1949, the young Syrian state was at enmity with Washington. First, Syria was at war with its American ally, Israel. In addition, Syria was the only country in the Middle East to block the Aramco pipeline, a network of an Arab-American oil company that was supposed to deliver vital oil for the reconstruction of Western Europe from the Persian Gulf. Under these circumstances, CIA officers formed an alliance with Syrian Army Chief of Staff Hosni al-Zaim. They tried to create a regime. Therefore, the first coup d'état in history against the background of constant conflicts with the Israelis was carried out by a protégé of the United States, General Hosni Zaim. Despite the inauguration of the president, Zaim's administration lasted only 138 days. Hosni Zaim was overthrown in another coup d'état. The next military leader to carry it out was Adib Shishakli, who took over state power in 1951. He proceeded to establish a presidential republic with a redistribution of power from legislative to executive, so the Americans tried to recruit him. In 1951, the United States prompted al-Shishakli to completely dissolve the already weakened parliament and declare a complete military dictatorship. But this did not suit the Syrians very much, so splits in the army and popular unrest eventually led to the resignation of Adib Shishakli in 1954. These U.S. efforts to ensure stability in Syria have, of course, had a terrible result. No one would like the fact that they want to establish a military dictatorship in their country for the sake of money and oil. So for years, Syria has become a place of coups d'état, bombed-out cities, and chaos. In 1963, as a result of a conspiracy, the Ba'ath Party came to power in the country with anti-Western sentiments. Then a series of another struggle for power and Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current dictator, began to rule the country. Bashar, whose middle son, inherited unilaterally into a semi-presidential republic in 2000. Although his reign was initially called milder than that of his father, in the end, it was he who tightened the screws around Syria, turning it into a place of eternal confrontation with up to a dozen forces at once. Bashar al-Assad tried to create an image of himself as a defender against domestic terrorists, such as the Islamic State, but instead became dependent on the support of foreign patrons, Iran and the Russian Federation. This aid is the main reason that the Assad government has been able to maintain its power. The twist of the noose around freedom of speech, free market and normal life has been twisted for more than a dozen years. It only got worse. So, in 2011, a civil war began to unfold in Syria. It all started with the demonstrations that were part of the Arab Spring. The protesters demanded the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad. The rallies did not stop, and the Syrian government began to use tanks and snipers to suppress them. In particularly troubled areas, water and electricity were cut off, and government forces began confiscating flour and food. The Syrian army laid siege to a number of cities, including Hama, Idlib, and Latakia. They were cold-blooded and cruel. Soldiers who refused to open fire on their fellow citizens were executed at the demonstrators by their own comrades from the Syrian army. It was during that period that the Syrian rebels and the opposition to the government realized that unarmed protests would not yield results. They will simply be destroyed by heavy armored vehicles or sarin, a poisonous deadly gas that Assad's army used to take control of a number of settlements. Of course, the dictator denied everything.
It's a game, a very primitive game to attack the Syrian army. The most important question is why? Because the terrorists have lost the American, French, and British support that was provided to destabilize Syria. They have lost their trump card.
Since then, this war has flared up and subsided, but only for a certain period of time. These confrontations have many conflicting sides, confusing even the devil. Foreign forces, including Iran, Russia and terrorist groups in the Middle East, support the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The Islamic State is trying to defend its interests. The opposition Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which grew up on a terrorist basis, but is now trying to fight for its own in a more civilized way. Turkey, which supports the rebels but is fighting against the Kurds, is another force that wants to create its own state on this territory. And ordinary Syrians are people who have been drowning in conflicts for generations. A large number of them, 11 million, are now refugees in other countries of the world, fleeing chemical attacks, torture, executions and total dictatorship. How does the world react to the fact that a country that is in the interests of both the collective West and the global South is constantly burning next to them? Concerns and resolutions on paper. We've seen this somewhere. For example, in Ukraine. At the end of November 2024, the rebels again began a confident movement against the positions of the Syrian government forces. Aleppo is already under rebel control. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group, which leads the opposition in Syria, entered the city of Aleppo on Friday, November 29.
It has already been geolocated that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is located in the center of Aleppo. Residents not only do not resist, but also welcome, contributing to the detachments that enter the city. Even if some Tiger forces or other Assad regime loyalists are still present, clinging to the eastern outskirts of the city is pointless, especially if the Turks and the Syrian National Army march in the north.
The Syrian army says it is suffering heavy casualties in killed and wounded clashes with rebels. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has captured part of the territory controlled by the pro-government military and is now gaining most of the districts of Aleppo. And this is the second largest city in the country. They do not plan to stop there. After all, later the rebels recorded a video with the slogan, "We're coming, Hamo." Hama is a city on the banks of the Orontes River, in central Syria, 47 kilometers north of the city of Homs, 209 kilometers from the capital Damascus. Hama is the fifth most populous city in Syria after Damascus, Aleppo, Homs and Latakia.
Meanwhile, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, who has been president of Syria since 2000, according to media reports, arrived in Russia on Thursday, despite the fact that his Russian counterpart and ally Vladimir Putin was at the CSTO summit in Kazakhstan. On Friday, November 29, the Kremlin spokesman finally commented on the situation in Syria, calling the rebel attack an encroachment on the sovereignty of Syria. And we are in favor of the Syrian authorities restoring order in the area as soon as possible and restoring constitutional order, he added.
The constitution has been talked about by those who are changing it to fit their own Russian dictator, who has been in power as long as Bashar al-Assad. And Russian aviation is helping the leader of Syria to do what they do best, to target civilian infrastructure. But does Russia still remain a reliable ally of the Syrian authorities if its own troops are now maximally involved in the war against Ukraine?
The root causes of the Syrian war and Russia's presence in principle on this theater of hostilities are the interests of Gazprom. There was an agreement with Assad: as long as Assad is in power, there will be no gas pipeline to Europe through the territory of Syria. For Comrade Miller, the head of Gazprom, this is just another source of stable income. It turns out that, in principle, it makes no sense to win in Syria, to keep a contingent there, to shed blood. Previously, it was beneficial against the backdrop of a mostly quiet international conflict landscape. Syria was a training camp, different officers, different soldiers, different professionals, different mercenaries were taken there on business trips, new tortures, new elements of sadism were worked out there, among other things. They mastered the sledgehammer. There they sawed people alive with saws. There they beheaded with axes, enjoying it as expected in the Russian world, as Russian soldiers embrace humanism. And all this had one way or another an order from above, which rested on the economic benefit of Gazprom. And now there is no such Gazprom. Its economic benefits cannot be maintained, including in this theater of operations. And the most important thing is to lose the meaning. And so, if earlier very serious attention was paid to the Syrian theater of operations, then even Surovikin himself, the same Surovikin, and he came, and he fought there, and he also received a certain number of awards. Now this front is somewhere in third or fourth place.
Rebel Brigade's commander Mustafa Abdel-Jabbar stated that the absence of pro-Iranian forces in Aleppo aided the swift advance. New details are also revealed by Ukrainian intelligence. The personnel of the Russian military contingent in Syria are in a depressed state due to the successes of the opposition forces, the capture of Aleppo, the fighting in the Ham area and the advance to Homs. The Syrian government army and military units of the aggressor state of Russia are suffering significant losses, fleeing from their positions, leaving weapons and equipment. The retreat is chaotic. Arabic Russian translators are urgently sent to the city of Hama, where hostilities are taking place, obviously, for the needs of officers of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, who are trying to bring Bashar al-Assad's troops to their senses. To help the Middle Eastern country, the Moscow leaders decided to send mercenaries from private military companies. Militants are expected to arrive, probably from the so-called Afria Orps. The newly formed axis of evil is beginning to realize that it is not exerting control in regions that were previously taken for granted. However, what this will lead to, only history will tell. The new rebel offensive in Syria comes at a turbulent time in the world. There is no need to go far from Syria. The conflict between Israel, Hamas and other terrorist organizations in the region continues. If we move a little further on the map of the world, the Russian Federation continues to wage an aggressive and bloody war in Ukraine. And young and caring Georgians continue to fight in protests for their right to freedom, which has not been suppressed by the pro-Russian authorities and Kremlin threats. The world is watching and silent. In words, he supports democracy, the will of the people, peace, and so far his deeds end with concern. The sanctions of anti-dictatorial regimes are still not strong enough, and those who need help still have to make their own way to victory over autocracy and dictatorship. The stories of Ukraine, Georgia and Syria prove that if you look at the map of the world and turn your heads towards the west or the east, there will be no full-fledged and all-encompassing good. But evil will definitely be noticeable from afar. And now, in the modern world, it is primarily associated with Russia. It was the 24 Hours to Peace program. And during this day, we did not even approach it. One morning we will wake up, and there will be only 24 hours before peace, and we won't know that yet. However, what this era will be like depends